Written by Kevin Williamson and directed by Wes Craven, Scream is largely credited with revitalizing the slasher subgenre of horror films when it was released in 1996. The film satirizes and subverts tropes of films that came before it, and comments on desensitization, media sensationalism, and spectacle. What really interests me about Scream, however, is its portrayal of sex, gender, and power. In this essay, I will examine Scream through feminist and queer lenses. I would like to take a moment before we begin, however, to issue a spoiler warning for this film, specifically Scream the original movie, which came out in 1996. I will not be discussing the sequels in this essay. This is an in-depth analysis of Scream and thus will spoil the plot, delve into details, and discuss theories and interpretations of the film. As you can probably tell from the fact that I have willingly written an entire 20-page single-spaced essay on this film, I highly recommend that you watch it if you have not seen it already. Otherwise, you have been warned. In the first segment of this essay, we'll look at Scream's treatment of its female characters. There are 5 major female characters in Scream: Sidney Prescott, the quintessential final girl; Tatum Riley, Sidney's best friend; Casey Becker, who is famously killed in the cold open of the film; Gale Weathers, a tenacious TV journalist; and Maureen Prescott, Sidney's late mother, who haunts the narrative. In this first section of the essay, we'll analyze the portrayal of these characters, how they stack up against their male counterparts, and how they subvert, or don't, the preceding tropes regarding women in the horror genre. In the second portion of this video, we'll look at Scream's killers, Billy Loomis and Stu Macher. For purposes of this essay, we'll analyze Billy and Stu as an iteration of the queer villain trope that was popularized in American cinema during the Hays Code era. We'll delve into why they might be portrayed as queer from a Doylist perspective, and alternately, why they might choose to be villains from a Watsonian perspective. Finally, in the third portion of this video, I'll discuss the ways in which the themes of sex and power are interwoven in Scream. We'll examine how sex is expressed explicitly or not, and how it is evoked through metaphor, and how power dynamics between the characters are expressed through 3 facets of sex: penetration, discourse, meaning verbal communication, and gender roles. As a disclaimer before we begin, my academic background is in English literature and law. You may notice that neither of those degrees are in film, women's studies, or queer studies. I thus approach this essay from more of a literary analysis angle, as it is what I'm trained in. I am not a professional film analyst. I simply do this because I love it and because my obsession with this movie will not let me rest. Without further ado, let's begin. Part 1. Women in Film. In this portion of the essay, I will look at Scream through 3 interpretive frameworks. The first of these is a psychoanalytic analysis. Just as the name suggests, this framework is designed around psychoanalytic principles such as scopophilia and audience identification with the characters on screen. The second framework is rhetorical analysis. This approach focuses more on literary and cinematic devices such as plot, point of view, and framing. Third and finally, we'll look at 2 qualitative studies and see how Scream compares with other slasher films. Psychoanalytic Analysis. In her 1974 essay, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, feminist theorist Laura Mulvey proposed that film is presented through the male gaze, which encourages audiences to identify with male protagonists and objectify female characters. Mulvey writes,
"In a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly. In their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact, so that they can be said to connote to be looked at-ness."
She argues that women are presented in an aesthetically pleasing and often titillating way so that their characters are reduced to visual objects rather than narrative agents. Mulvey writes of male characters,
"The spectator identifies with the main male protagonist. He projects his look onto that of his like, his screen surrogate."
Professor Alan McKee, notable for his research on pornography, summarizes Mulvey's arguments as saying,
"To be looked at for identification is to be powerful. To be looked at for pleasure is to be powerless."
Scream does not follow Mulvey's framework exactly as she proposes it, although the film does play with the concepts of looking and being looked at that she argues are so important in film. Scream diverges from Mulvey's framework in a number of ways. First, the film features a female protagonist. By following Casey in the opening scene and then Cindy for the remainder of the film, the audience is naturally put in their perspective rather than in the perspective of the male characters. Not all of Scream is shown from Sydney's perspective. There are several scenes where she is absent. However, none of the main male cast is particularly appealing as an audience surrogate. The characters who would potentially fill this role most closely are Billy, who is too off-putting, and Dewey, who is too bumbling. Second, Scream attempts to forego female objectification. Director Wes Craven deliberately withholds imagery of nude women, instead going out of his way to imply the presence of Sydney's naked breasts in various scenes without actually showing them. Sid bares her chest to Billy, but not the viewer, meaning that the viewer is not aligned with the male stand-in character as Mulvey would suggest. This choice on Craven's part seems to come from a desire to subvert slasher tropes rather than out of a feminist desire to not objectify women.
There's one of your great, I think, lines or little speeches coming up here where she dismisses the entire horror genre because of its kind of predictability.
What's your favorite scary movie?
Oh, come on, you know I don't watch that shit.
And its depiction of women.
No,
Right.
no. It's
I do think this goal is undermined by the infamous Tatum nipple shot. In every other instance, we are not shown blatant female eye candy, and this is by design. Tatum is a more sexual character throughout the film.
Stu was with me last night, okay?
Yeah, it was.
Tom Cruise and all the right moves. You know, if you pause it just right, you can see his penis.
But these are all by her own choices and actions. I feel that showing her nipples, even though she is clearly wearing a bra, is purely for the benefit of the boys in the audience, in a way that Craven deliberately avoided throughout the rest of the film with Sydney as per his director's commentary. It undermines the subversive through line present throughout the rest of the film, which is a real shame. Third, Scream breaks immersion by breaking the fourth wall. Mulvey writes that
the conventions of narrative film subordinate the view of the camera and of the audience into the view of the characters in diegesis, the conscious aim being always to eliminate the intrusive camera presence and prevent a distancing awareness in the audience.
this is not the case in Scream, where dialogue frequently reminds the viewer that they are watching a movie.
Scary night, isn't it? With the murders and all, it's like right out of a horror movie or something.
But this is life. This isn't a movie.
Sure it is, Sid.
Hey, Sid, just think, if they make a movie about you, who's gonna play you?
No, please don't kill me, Mr. Ghostface. I want to be in the sequel.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie.
Breaking the fourth wall like this creates a separation from the characters on screen and the audience. This separation allows space for the audience to reflect on their viewing experience as the film is ongoing. While Scream does not follow Mulvey's framework exactly, it does play with the concepts of looking and being looked at that she discusses, especially in diegesis. Mulvey writes,
The cinema offers a number of possible pleasures. One is scopophilia. There are circumstances in which looking itself is a source of pleasure.
Embellishing on this idea, Professor Richard Dyer writes,
The idea of looking as power and being looked at as powerlessness overlaps with ideas of activity and passivity. Thus, to look is thought of as active, whereas to be looked at is passive.
This idea is exemplified in Scream by Ghostface watching his female victims while they can't see him. We don't get this interplay with any of the male victims because we only hear Ghostface on the phone with Sid and Casey. Even this dynamic can be broken into active-passive, calling versus receiving a call. This idea gains an additional metatextual level when you consider that Roger L. Jackson, the voice of Ghostface on the phone, watched the actors through a monitor while filming the call scenes, but they were never allowed to even meet him. Outside of diegesis and into the realm of Mulvey, we might notice that only the girls are on screen in these scenes, not Ghostface, who remains hidden from the audience. This begs the question, does the audience identify with the killer since we too are looking at the girls? Or does the audience identify with the girls since we also feel menaced by the killer? In her 1996 essay, Feminist Frameworks for Horror Films, academic Cynthia Freeland constructs a hypothetical application of Mulvey's theories specific to horror films.
The tension between the viewer's desire to look and the ongoing narrative of a film is especially acute in the horror film. Typically in horror, the woman or visual object is also the chief victim, sacrificed to the narrative desire to know about the monster. The viewer must turn attention to the narrative thrust of the investigator, typically a male, who will complete the story for us.
This construction holds true for certain films such as Psycho or Jaws, where the first victim is a woman and the subsequent investigator character is a man, but not Scream, at least to a certain extent. The first victim is technically Steve, although Casey is focused on much more heavily and is a much more memorable first victim. However, the investigator characters are both women, Sydney and Gale, and to a lesser extent Dewey. Freeland also presents the feminist psychoanalytic film theories of several other academics. Especially pertinent for our purposes is the work of Professor Barbara Creed, who argues that horror texts all serve to illustrate the work of abjection through the following three elements. First, depicting images of abjection such as corpses and bodily wastes. Second, showing the threatened stability of the symbolic order. And third, constructing the maternal figure as abject. Scream ticks all three of these boxes. First, the corpses of Steve, Casey, and Tatum are prominently showcased in all their gruesome glory. Secondly, the stability of the symbolic order is shaken by the Woodsboro murders. The town shuts down for curfew, and the idea of childlike innocence itself is called into question by the teenage killers.
Think you did it?
20 years ago, I would have said not a chance. But these kids today, damned if I know.
Even the sanctity of the home and the apparent safety that the boundary between inside and out represents is disrupted by Ghostface's repeated home invasions. Third, the abject mother. One of Sydney's chief anxieties is that she will turn out just like her mother, a woman that she loved and believed in who becomes more strange to her as the film progresses, and she becomes less certain that Cotton Weary raped her and more certain that her mom was sleeping around, something she didn't want to believe.
And I can't keep lying to myself about who my mom was.
Rhetorical Analysis. In Feminist Frameworks for Horror Films, Freeland argues that psychoanalytic models should not be the dominant framework for feminist analysis, but rather one of many lenses used when assessing horror films. Freeland proposes two additional models, a historical analysis and a rhetorical analysis. For our purposes, we will focus on the rhetorical. She writes,
My proposal for producing feminist readings or interpretations of horror films is that we should focus on the representational contents and on the nature of the representational practices, so as to scrutinize how the films represent gender, sexuality, and power relations between the sexes. I suggest that feminist readings of a horror film proceed by looking at various crucial sorts of film elements.
Her analytical framework places less emphasis on psychology and more emphasis on literary and cinematic devices. Freeland provides a set of example analysis questions to probe into the representations of gender, sexuality, and power in horror films. For purposes of this essay, I've chosen to discuss the three I feel are most relevant to analyzing Scream. How do the film structures of narrative, point of view, and plot construction operate in affecting a depiction of gender roles and relations? I would argue that Scream presents the story largely from Casey and then Sydney's point of view. There are perhaps a couple of scenes where the audience is put in Gale, Tatum, Dewey, or another character's point of view, or else are expected to view as a neutral outside observer. For instance, the scene where Gale and Kenny are jump scared by Dewey and when Gale returns to the van after Kenny's murder are from Gale's POV. The scenes where Billy's being interrogated at the police station and where Gale arrives to threaten the boys with the gun, the scene in the video store, the scene where Sheriff Burke, Dewey, and Principal Himbry prepare to interrogate the students feel more like they're from a neutral perspective. I don't think we're ever really put in the shoes of a male character until the climax when Billy is searching for Sydney. Up until that point, every male character, aside from probably Kenny, is a suspect. Billy, Stu, Randy, Dewey, Sheriff Burke, Sydney's dad, and even Principal Himbry give the audience some reason to suspect them. We are almost certain the killer is a man, so we can never be fully in a male character's POV because we're at least a little suspicious of them. Until the climax, when we know who the killers are and follow Stu as he answers the phone and Billy as he searches for Sydney. We, like the killers, don't know where Sydney is hiding, so we are aligned with them briefly in this scene.
The scenes where we follow Sydney, Casey, Gale, or Tatum, we trust that they aren't secretly the killer, and so we can put ourselves in their POV because they don't have any clues that we don't. By aligning the audience with mainly female point of view characters, Scream asks us to treat them as people and not as objects. How does Scream comment upon genre precedents regarding women in slasher films? Scream plays around a lot with the final girl virgin trope that was the genre standard as it was understood in pop culture at the time. The film brings this one up a lot explicitly, and Sid, of course, subverts the trope. The film seems to want to subvert the genre's objectification of female characters. Casey is dressed very conservatively, and Gale, while other characters comment on her attractiveness, is never objectified through shot composition. The exception, of course, is Tatum, which, as I've said, I think seriously undermines what the film was going for with this subversion. Additionally, Casey, Gale, Sydney, and Tatum all exhibit fight and flight behaviors as opposed to freeze behaviors, making them feel more active and less passive. More on this later when we discuss the qualitative analyses. What are Scream's implicit rhetorical presuppositions about gender roles and relations? Does the film invite the audience to challenge these assumptions? I think the film presumes that being a slut is bad, but it also invites the audience to have sympathy for Maureen based on the offensive way that Billy and Stu talk about her and the considerate way that Tatum talks about her. In the kitchen scene, Billy and Stu speak about Maureen in a repulsively misogynist way, relentlessly slut-shaming her in their villain monologue. The blatant misogyny in the words they use, the venom with which they're said, and the fact that they're speaking ill of the dead to the woman's own daughter, I think is meant to elicit shock in the viewer and spark a desire for them to treat Maureen with more respect. Billy and Stu continue to use degrading language toward women throughout the climax, mainly through the frequent use of the word bitch directed at Sydney.
Bitch! You bitch! 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 Bitch!
By giving this misogynist behavior to the villains of the film, and having its target be Sydney, the character which the audience likely sympathizes with the most, and her dead mother, I believe Scream invites the audience to condemn Billy and Stu's misogyny alongside their other villainous acts. In contrast, Tatum speaks about Maureen in a much more empathetic way. She acknowledges the pervasive attitude of the town regarding Maureen and the likely truth of the rumors about her. However, while she believes the rumors, she doesn't condemn Maureen for her promiscuous behavior the way Billy and Stu do. Instead, she speculates that Maureen was lonely and dissatisfied in her marriage to a frequently absent husband. The more charitable view of Maureen that Tatum's insight suggests, I believe, is also an invitation to challenge audience presuppositions that female promiscuity is inherently wicked and unreasonable. Qualitative analysis. How subversive is Scream, really, when it comes to the treatment of its female characters? I looked at two studies, one which examines the roles, sexualization, and brutalization of women in slasher films, and one which focused on final girls. In their study, Lady and the Vamp, Roles, Sexualization, and Brutalization of Women in Slasher Films, criminal justice students Wellman, Madel, and Kincaid looked at 48 slasher films and assessed how the female characters were portrayed. Amusingly, Casey Becker's gruesome killing after a flirtatious phone call with her killer in Scream is cited in the introduction of their paper as a prime example of how sexualized or sexual women are punished severely across the genre. This does not bode well. Summarizing previous studies on how gender is portrayed in slashers, Wellman et al. Write,
male characters often provide direction for the female characters, who present as less intelligent, less resourceful, weaker, and more anxious.
In this regard, I believe Scream succeeds in breaking genre conventions. For the most part, the male characters seem less competent than their female counterparts. Compare Randy, Dewey, and Kenny to Sydney, Tatum, and Gale. Kenny takes orders from Gale, no one really takes Dewey seriously, and while Randy outlines the rules for how to survive, none of the other characters take him seriously, and none of the main female characters are even present in that scene. As video essayist Video Nasty says in their own analysis of the film,
Scream uses its male character's semi-incompetence to reiterate its female character's strengths.
However, Wellman et al. Also summarize that
violence against female characters in slashers tends to be more frequent, longer, and more torturous, both physically and mentally. When an attack ended with death, female characters also had longer deaths than the male characters.
I do think that Scream falls into this trope, suffering a bit from Hitchcock's torture the women mentality. Kenny, and apparently Dewey and Randy, are killed pretty instantly, while Ghostface takes great pleasure in torturing Casey and Sidney over the phone for long stretches of time. Casey's death in particular is very protracted compared to other deaths in the film. The results of Wellman et al.'s study indicate that
among the 252 female characters in slasher films, their purity was significantly linked to their level of brutalization and their risk of death. When measuring fate of characters, those females who lived were equally divided as pure versus not pure. However, most females who were killed were not pure, confirming that sexualized women were more likely to die than non-sexualized women.
2 women are killed on screen in Scream, and 1 more before the events of the story. All 3 could be considered not pure. Maureen is self-explanatory, Casey had that flirtatious phone call, and Tatum is sexualized and implied to be sexually active. However, Sidney has sex and still does survive, of course.
The just world hypothesis is a well-known psychology theory that refers to the widely held belief that the world is a good place where good people are rewarded and bad people are punished.
This idea, while comforting, can lead to victim blaming. Wellman et al. Summarize,
women who do not conform to societal demands for purity are deemed whores and responsible for any transgressions committed against them. By assuming a victim is responsible for their own victimization as a result of bad behaviors such as sex, there is comfort in the idea that bad things only happen to bad people in our just world.
This logic is perhaps partially why slasher films devote more time to showing the suffering of sexual female characters.
Oliver, 1993, in her study of adolescence, found that male participants who held more traditional views of female sexuality were more likely to report motivations for watching slasher films, such as to see the victims get what they deserve.
Yikes! Could this be a possible motivation for Billy and Stu's murder spree? Maureen, Casey and Steve, Sidney, Principal Himbry, and Sidney's father seem to be Billy and Stu's primary targets, while Kenny, Gail, Dewey, and probably Randy and Tatum were either inconveniences or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. They clearly think Maureen got what she deserved. They monologue about exactly that. Casey broke up with Stu for Steve, so both of them probably got what they deserved for that slight in Ghostface's eyes. Billy obviously resents Sidney. It's less clear what the boys' thoughts are on Sidney's dad and Himbry. Furthermore,
it is possible that this just world hypothesis, as applied to slasher films, is gendered, such that the determination of whether a character is good or bad is gender dependent.
Essentially, the same trait, for instance, assertiveness, might be good for a male character but bad for a female character. What characters deserve is potentially gender dependent. That seems to be true with respect to sexual behavior in Billy and Stu's eyes, since they have a clear double standard when it comes to their own sexual behavior.
The dead man.
See also Billy constantly trying and eventually succeeding at getting into Sid's pants, not to mention all the sex they were obviously having with each other. Maureen and Sid deserve to die because they are sexual beings, yet Billy and Stu get to carry on and plan the sequel. In concluding their paper, Wellman et al. Argue that
traditionally held beliefs that sexual women are promiscuous vamps or whores allows for their torture, brutalization, and death to be viewed more as entertainment and less as grotesque treatment.
I don't think this is necessarily the case with Casey's death, since we see her final moments from the POV of her parents, and the musical score lends an incredibly tragic tone to the scene. However, the final shot of her body is certainly primarily intended to serve as shock value. In other words, entertainment.
Slasher films broadly continue to share the narrative that sexualized women are devalued, and yet simultaneously use the sexualization of girls and women as a key element of the genre.
In their study, Embodying the Moral Code, 30 Years of Final Girls in Slasher Films, psychology students Weaver, Taylor, Menard, and Cabrera looked at female characters in the 10 highest-grossing slasher films of the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. They write,
it is a well-known stereotype among slasher fans that the most telling indicator of a bad and ultimately disposable girl in the slasher film is sexual activity. On the other side of this Madonna-whore dichotomy is the final girl, who, by virtue of her refusal to engage in licentious behavior, is rewarded with survival.
Obviously, one of Kevin Williamson's biggest goals in this film is to subvert this trope specifically. There's only one female character in Scream who engages in sex, and that's Sydney, not counting Gail, who shares a horizontal kiss with Dewey, though she survives too. We were not explicitly shown the sex, of course, we cut away. On the one hand, I like this because 1, she's a high school character, and 2, it's respectful and does not objectify her. On the other hand, if we were explicitly shown the sex, would she still have survived? Weaver et al. Found that
final girls were no more likely than other primary female characters to be virgins. In fact, a sizable minority were identified as sexually active. But final girls could be distinguished from other primary female characters in terms of their sexual behaviors.
Shown on screen. Some final girls
engaged in sexual behavior that was implied but not depicted. However, none of the final girls were shown engaging in explicit sexual behavior on screen, compared with 16.7% of other primary female characters. Similarly, the final girl was distinctive in her lack of on-screen nudity.
Sid falls into the implied sexual behavior category, though no Scream characters engage in explicit sexual behavior on screen. So Sid goes the farthest of any of the Scream women, but not as far as she could go.
As long as the viewer is not exposed to gratuitous nudity or explicit sexual acts involving the final girl, her relatively innocent image may be preserved.
It would have perhaps been more subversive, although less tasteful, if Sid had engaged in explicit on-screen sex and still lived to see the end of the movie. Similarly, no on-screen nudity allowed for Sid. Wes Craven made a point of that. He acts like that's subversive, and it would be for other female characters. However, it's apparently typical for final girls like Sid to never show her tits until she goes legits. Scream excels in some aspects and falls flat in others. Scream kills off 2 female characters, both of whom would traditionally deserve to die by slasher standards. Casey is flirtatious, despite having a boyfriend, and Tatum is more of a fun-loving party girl, as well as being objectified right before her death. However, the film also does not suggest that these characters somehow deserved what they got. Both deaths are pretty sad. I found Tatum to be very likable, and also appreciated the reminder in the scene in her bedroom that she's just a kid still, with her very juvenile pajamas and stuffed animal. The score and focus on her parents emphasize the tragedy of Casey's death, as well as Sydney's lingering look at her empty chair in class the following day. The female victims fight back, but more focus is also given to female suffering. Ultimately, Scream did a good job of subverting some tropes regarding female characters in horror movies, but was not as subversive as it could have been. Androgyny and the final girl. Weaver et al. Write,
some have argued that the final girl is an empowering figure who survives particularly due to her rejection of traditional female roles. This theory was supported by the results of this study, which showed that final girls were twice as likely to be characterized as androgynous compared with other primary female characters.
Similarly, Wellman et al. Write that the final girl
rejects the traditional female script of weakness and reliance on males and subscribes to the masculine script of strength and ability to protect oneself and others. She serves as a gender bender, able to confront fear, stay level-headed, outperform male characters, and often kill the killer.
While Sydney certainly fits this description, the other female characters of Scream also tend to outperform their male counterparts. Of the main female cast of the film, Sydney, Gail, and Tatum all fight back against the killers. Casey is more visibly frightened, but puts in a good effort by arming herself with a knife, being smart and stealthy enough to hide outside the house, and landing a blow on the killer with her phone. In contrast, Steve is bound and cries all throughout his death, and Principal Himbry, Kenny, Randy, and impliedly Dewey do not land a single blow on Ghostface. Dewey, God bless him, is fairly useless throughout the film, and Kenny is subordinate to Gail. Sydney's father is bound and gagged, and Sydney saves him in the climax of the film. In her essay, Examining Portrayals of Female Protagonists by Female Screenwriters Using Feminist Critical Discourse Analysis, Brooke Shapiro found that female film protagonists written by female screenwriters tended to follow the heroine's journey, a narrative structure created by Maureen Murdoch in response to Joseph Campbell's hero's journey.
The heroine's journey is about a heroine who must find balance as she struggles between the sides of a duality, a feminine and a masculine side.
She begins the story feminine, rejects the feminine, embraces the masculine, and eventually reincorporates the feminine and integrates the feminine and masculine. In the climax of the film, Sydney takes on the Ghostface persona. She calls Billy and Stu on the phone using the voice modulator and dons the costume before stabbing Billy. Throughout the film, Ghostface is depicted as masculine. The voice modulator makes the user's voice deeper, Tatum calls him Mr. Ghostface, the killings are something only a man could do, according to Stu, the grunts when fighting sound masculine, and both killers are in actuality male. Prior to donning the costume, Sydney primarily fled from her attackers, and when caught in fights, she kicked and grappled. After donning the costume, though, Sydney is able to fight to kill, and more than that, she's able to stab, penetrating the boundary of the flesh. As Video Nasty puts it,
Sydney then proceeds to come out of the closet and phallically penetrate Billy dressed as Ghostface. Reading this through a queer lens potentially shifts the binary female way the audience perceives Sydney.
At this stage of her heroine's journey, Sydney embraces the masculine by taking on the Ghostface persona. She then discards the costume, though she continues to solely fight rather than flee for the remainder of the film, and continues to penetrate the boundary of the flesh of her opponents by biting Stu, fingering Billy's wound, and shooting Billy in the head. By continuing to fight even without the Ghostface costume, Sydney has integrated the masculine and feminine.
J.A. Kurzweil suggests in The Slasher Movie Book that a resourceful, likable, and often androgynous final girl appeals to both male and female viewers.
Similarly, Wellman et al. Speculate that
the androgyny of the final girl may allow the young male viewer to relate to her.
In psychoanalytic frameworks of feminist film analysis, to be looked at for identification is powerful. It is subversive under Mulvey's theories to encourage identification with a female character rather than objectification. However, these studies posit her androgynous qualities are necessary to facilitate this identification. Conclusion on women in film. Scream is interesting when read through a feminist psychoanalytic lens. Mulvey's ideas of looking and being looked at are present, though subverted for the most part. While male characters in diegesis may indeed watch their female victims, the audience is encouraged to separate from the male gaze of the in-universe characters by constant fourth wall breaks. Finally, Creed's theory on the abject in horror is exemplified in Scream by gruesome imagery, Ghostface transgressing the boundaries of the symbolic order, and Sydney's alienation from her rose-colored perception of her mother. Scream uses literary and cinematic devices to encourage audience identification with the perspectives of its female characters. It makes a mostly successful attempt to not objectify its female characters. Finally, it encourages the audience to challenge their presuppositions about the wickedness of female sexuality through dialogue. However, the film is also a bit of a mixed bag in terms of subverting how women are typically depicted in the slasher genre. Sydney has sex and survives, yes, but all of the female victims were also sexual. The female victims' deaths are treated as sad rather than just, but more focus is given to female suffering than male suffering. Finally, Sydney's journey in the third act of the film follows the heroine's journey tropes of embracing the masculine, reincorporating the feminine, and integrating the masculine and feminine. Like other final girls, she is depicted as androgynous, which may make her more relatable to audience members of all genders. Part 2. Queer Villainy. Queer villains are a classic staple of American cinema. In this section, I will briefly cover the history of queer villains, particularly in horror films, and discuss how that legacy is reflected in Billy and Stu. I will interpret their relationship through Doylist and Watsonian lenses. A Doylist lens analyzes the story through the eyes of the author, e.g. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the real-life author of the Sherlock Holmes stories. A Watsonian lens analyzes the story through the lens of the characters in diegesis, e.g. Dr. John Watson, the in-universe author of the Sherlock Holmes stories. Brief overview of queer coding and history of queer villains. In her trope talk on queer-coded villains, Overly Sarcastic Productions Red summarizes,
between 1934 and 1968, this standard was strongly enforced in U.S. film production down to the letter. Your movie could not portray sin or violations of the natural law in any kind of sympathetic context, which means if you wanted to put queer stuff in your movie, your only option was to put it on a bad guy.
Queer characters could only exist in film if they were villainous, and in the inverse, villains who had queer characteristics would seem more strange and scary to mainstream audiences. As a result,
Horror is one of the earliest film genres to use overt or stereotypical queer behaviors to make its monsters scarier.
Hays Code-era horror films such as Bride of Frankenstein, Dracula's Daughter, Psycho, and Rebecca all include villainous and heavily stereotyped queer characters. Films that have come out after the Hays Code ended continue to use queer coding to amplify the monstrosity of their villains, as filmmakers continue to make use of the shorthand for evil that originated during that period. This includes horror films such as The Silence of the Lambs, Sleepaway Camp, and Fright Night. As horror buffs, Billy and Stu would likely have seen all of these films. In fact, we know that Psycho is a particular favorite of theirs. Billy references its queer villain Norman Bates twice.
We all go a little mad sometimes. I don't really believe in motive, Sid. I mean, did Norman Bates have a motive? No.
And is also particularly informative to Scream itself. The Silence of the Lambs also seems to be one of Billy's favorites, as he references it twice as well.
It's like Jodie Foster in Silence of the Lambs when she keeps having flashbacks of her dead father. Did they ever really decide why Hannibal Lecter liked to eat people? Don't think so.
It should come as no surprise that Scream draws on this lengthy tradition of queer horror villains. As Video Nasty says,
the homosocial dynamic displayed by Billy and Stu throughout the film can easily be read as that of secret gay lovers, two boys masquerading their heterosexuality as much as they masquerade their innocence.
In his book, Murder Most Queer, The Homicidal Homosexual in the American Theater, Professor Jordan Schildkraut writes,
"The conspiracy of criminals mirrors the conspiracy of secret lovers, a couple with a secret, hoping no one will find out the criminal act they have committed together."
The murder conspiracy serves as a metaphorical stand-in in this sense. Billy and Stu conceal this conspiratorial relationship from Sidney and everyone else until the climax of the film, when they are finally able to come out and be truly seen. Billy and Stu are clearly ecstatic at finally being able to let the mask drop. Billy smiles more than we've seen in the entire movie at this point, and Stu's already high level of energy shoots through the roof. They're also able to finally show their affection for each other openly, with Stu embracing Billy from behind and Billy gazing at Stu with undisguised desire. Additionally, Stu miraculously finds his second wind and attacks Sidney in anger when he thinks that she's killed Billy. The homoeroticism of Billy and Stu's relationship is not lost on the other characters in the film.
You gotta find me first, you pansy-ass mama's boy!
Or on the cast.
Listen, there's only one love of my life in that movie.
It's Billy.
And he's sitting right here.
Standing right there.
Me, you mean, right? Yes. Okay, all right. Yeah, Billy and Stu are the first husbands of horror. Woo!
Definitely.
Nor is it lost on the audience. Parodies of Scream, Scary Movie, and Screamed in Unauthorized Musical Parody invariably make Billy and Stu more explicitly gay. Doylist Explanation. A Doylist explanation for Billy and Stu's behavior would indicate that because horror villains traditionally tend to be queer, Billy and Stu fit with this pattern for the same reason, to make them scarier. Horror as a medium has more of a license to delve into the disturbing, the perverse, the taboo. Highlighting those qualities that mainstream audiences would find disturbing in the villains of your movie is one way to heighten the horror. As a commentary on the horror genre, Scream lovingly adapts many elements from horror classics. Billy and Stu being queer could perhaps be an homage to these classic villains. Another avenue of Doylist analysis might focus on Kevin Williamson's acknowledgement that Billy and Stu are based on infamous real-life gay murderers Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. In an interview with Pride Source, Williamson said,
"If you Google Leopold and Loeb, you will see, and you'll read about it, and you'll get, okay, that's Billy and Stu."
Leopold and Loeb, two teenage college students, murdered 14-year-old Bobby Franks in Chicago in 1924, apparently out of a desire to commit the perfect crime and get away with it. Their trial and conviction were highly publicized, and their story has since been dramatized many times. The case lends itself well to drama, Schildkraut argues, for two reasons. One, the mystery of the apparently motiveless murder, and two, the homosexual relationship between the two partners in crime. Probably the most famous dramatization of the Leopold and Loeb case is Patrick Hamilton's 1929 play Rope, adapted to film by Alfred Hitchcock in 1948. Billy and Stu's portrayal seems to take particular inspiration from Rope. In Hamilton's play,
The young killer's sexual relationship is an unspoken secret, one constructed only by insinuation, merely hinting at a physical intimacy between the two boys. The first time we see them in full light, Brandon puts his arm around Granillo as he lights a cigarette from the other boy's match.
This physical contact is mirrored in Stu embracing Billy. Their closeness can also be inferred through their seamless coordination when Sydney first runs into the kitchen, Stu tossing the voice mod to Billy, how they exchange weapons without even a shared glance, they're so in sync. Further similarities exist between the two killers' contrasting personalities.
In Rope, Brandon is the leader, stoic, and becomes more assertive and threatening as the play progresses. Meanwhile, Granillo is the follower, more affable, and becomes more hysterical as the play progresses.
This dynamic is echoed in Billy and Stu. Billy, like Brandon, becomes more aggressive, while Stu collapses into hysterics like Granillo.
My mom and dad are gonna be so
I thought, again, it was a great moment where you see Billy's just out of control. He's not Mr. Cool anymore. He's just acting off of pure, violent, sort of impotent rage.
Parallels can also be drawn between the Leopold and Loeb case and Scream with regard to the apparently motiveless crime.
See, it's a lot scarier when there's no motive, Sid.
According to the popular narrative, Leopold and Loeb killed out of a desire to prove their intellectual superiority, to craft a perfect crime and get away with murder. This desire is perhaps reflected in Billy and Stu's desire to create a perfect horror movie. I think Billy and Stu consider the horror movie that they've constructed a beautiful and shocking artistic creation. They put great attention into the drama of the plot. They clearly take great pride in it.
Perfect ending. I thought of that.
And the way the victims are disemboweled and hung can be interpreted as the carrying out of an artistic vision. See also the hanging dolls, maquettes for the full-scale pieces. I do think Stu does particularly murder for kicks, as Schildkraut puts it. Billy too. They clearly have fun getting a little silly with it while in costume. There's also the thrill that comes with getting away with it that I suspect they're chasing after successfully framing Cotton Weary, and the adrenaline rush that comes with the chasing and fighting. They also clearly take a sadistic pleasure in toying with their victims over the phone.
Yeah.
In addition, Billy has a concrete motive to kill Maureen and a vendetta against Sid, and Stu has an implied vendetta against Casey and Steve. But there's also the fact that the original murder, Maureen, was clearly Billy's idea, which Stu went along with. As Kevin Williamson says, Billy was the leader and Stu was the follower. Stu doesn't really have a reason to do this other than the fact that he would do anything for Billy. Watsonian Explanation. Rather than examining Williamson's intent, a Watsonian analysis of Billy and Stu's relationship would instead treat the boys themselves as the authors of their own story. In The Mocker's master bedroom with Sid, Billy says about life, "It's all one big movie."
You can't pick your genre.
In direct contradiction to this statement, Billy has spent the entire runtime of Scream choosing to make his life a horror movie on purpose and casting himself and Stu as the killer. Throughout Scream, we see that all five of the main gang, but especially Billy, contextualize their lives through the framework of horror movies.
The Exorcist was on. Got me thinking of you. It's like Jodie Foster in Silence of the Lambs.
As discussed earlier, the only way to be queer in such a movie is to be evil. Video Nasty remarks,
Billy's references to cinema, specifically queer horror cinema, aligns with queer readings of metatextuality. He cannot confront his own killings without it, much like he cannot confront his own queerness.
Billy loves horror films to the point of molding his own life to be one. To self-actualize, he needs to filter his life through the lens of horror films and himself through the trope of the queer villain. In her video on the history of queer coding, Jessica Kellgren-Fozard remarks,
And interestingly, going back to villains for a minute, how many of them also become queer fan favourites because they speak to us as characters who sit outside the mainstream, who live between the lines of society and uncover the truth of the narrative. They're sympathetic to those of us who also aren't the mainstream.
Queer audiences identify with villains because we find their difference or otherness relatable. This naturally applies to horror movie monsters too. In an interview with the LA Times, Guillermo del Toro explained,
You feel that outcast, and I think the monsters, you start pouring that empathy to them.
Billy and Stu exhibit the queer tendency to identify with villains to such an extent that they have adopted their behavior themselves. This is the only way they know to express themselves fully. They can only be queer when they're being villainous. Their emulation of queer horror villains is an avenue for self-expression. Beyond being empathetic or relatable, queer villains may be embraced as representation by some queer audiences. Queer villains are often confident, unrepressed, and unapologetic, which can be inspiring for audience members who are stuck in the closet. Professor Melanie Conan suggests that
audiences may, in fact, embrace the villain over the hero because the villain offers an alternative vision of life or an alternative life path, and one that doesn't end in heterosexual romance.
For queer audiences, queer villains can be more than relatable, they can be aspirational, especially to certain people whose movie-freaked minds have lost their reality button. Schildkraut writes,
by romanticizing criminal transgression, LGBT artists can exchange the role of the victim for the empowering fantasy of the queer killer, combating violent persecution with violent action, and replacing shame with defiant pride.
Stepping into the role of killer, I think, is empowering for Billy and Stu. It provides them with an acceptable, under Hays Code standards, avenue to be themselves with pride. Furthermore, Schildkraut argues that queer villain characters
also probe the darker anxieties and fears that can affect queer lives and relationships, including victimization from homophobia, the oppression of the closet, and the devastation of AIDS.
Billy as a character is all about contained, suppressed, brewing rage.
It just gives that sort of sense of incredible tension that this character is under right now.
I think his main motivation to kill Sydney is that he resents her after having to fake being in love with her for years and all the ways in which she reminds him of Maureen. A lot of this repressed rage can also come from the oppression of the closet that Schildkraut discusses. As Nev Campbell theorizes in an interview with Pride Source,
I would say that there was perhaps some confusion with them, in that maybe some of their anger comes from not being allowed to be who they want to be.
In crafting their perfect horror movie plot, Billy and Stu have cast themselves as the queer killer, a role which traditionally does not survive the film. They both show a willingness to subvert genre tropes as much as they lean into them. Billy breaks the no sex rule, and Stu breaks the no drinking and I'll be right back rules. Do they think that since this is their movie and they're in charge, this time the killer can win? Schildkraut hypothesizes that queer artists may write queer villains in order to take control of the narrative. Billy and Stu's plot can be read as both playing into the traditional queer villain role to achieve a sense of belonging and actualization, while simultaneously taking control of the narrative and drafting a new script for this character archetype that allows them to survive. Conclusion on queer villainy. To conclude, Billy and Stu follow in the classic tradition of queer killers in horror films. The implied queerness that exists in their behaviors, and especially their conspiratorial relationship with one another, is obvious to the characters, cast, and audience of Scream. A Doylist explanation for their relationship might suggest that Billy and Stu are queer as an homage to classic queer villains, fictional and real. Kevin Williamson has revealed that he based their relationship off of Leopold and Loeb, a mastermind with an accomplice who kills out of love for the other. Other adaptations of the Leopold and Loeb case, such as Rope, share clear similarities with Billy and Stu. A Watsonian explanation of Billy and Stu's relationship focuses less on Williamson's intent and instead looks at Billy and Stu's intent as the authors of their own story, the creators of their own perfect horror movie. In crafting their film, they have chosen to embody the role of queer killer. This choice may come out of a love for and identification with classic queer horror villains, and a desire to finally have a plot where the queer character gets to carry on and plan the sequel. Part 3. Sex and Power. Introduction. As the adage goes, everything in the world is about sex, except sex. Sex is about power. This is especially applicable to film and literature. In his nonfiction book Dance Macabre, Stephen King writes,
sex continues to be a driving force in the horror genre, sometimes presented in disguised Freudian terms, and much of the sex is deeply involved in power tripping.
Scream, as a commentary on the horror genre, is emblematic of this thematic focus on sex and power.
In this section of the essay, I will first look at how everything is about sex by examining the metaphors used to evoke it. Second, I will look at how sex is about power by examining the simultaneous sexual dynamics and power dynamics between Sydney, Billy, and Stu. Everything is about sex, stabbing as a sex metaphor. In her essay on Stephen King's Misery, Professor Natalie Schroeder argues that multiple weapons used throughout the novel, such as the cross Annie uses to stab the state trooper and the axe she uses to dismember Paul's foot, are phallic symbols. Similarly, John Carpenter equates the long knife Laura uses to stab Michael in Halloween to a phallic symbol. The same can be said of Ghostface's knife. In his video on Scream, Zach Morris observes,
"The way Stu cleans off the knife is very interesting to me. The motion almost kind of resembles taking off a condom."
The knife, a tool for penetrating the flesh of the body, serves as a metaphorical representation of the penis. Drawing attention to the wiping clean of the knife ironically emphasizes the blood. Although this doesn't happen in all cases, it is stereotypical that a person will bleed when having penetrative vaginal sex for the first time. This symbolism thematically resonates with the core plot thread of Sydney's loss of virginity. A knife is to a penis as stabbing is to penetrative sex. Schildkraut writes,
French psychoanalytic philosopher Georges Bataille cites the novel of The Marquis de Sade when he argues that sexual activity is a form of violence, a form of physical violation bordering on murder, which is why our society's strongest taboos are against murder and certain sexual activities. Sex and murder, then, are twin taboos that are often interchanged, both in the subconscious and in works of fiction, and eroticized as acts of transgression.
We see both sex and murder in Scream. Sex can't be explicitly shown or we'll get that NC-17 rating that we're trying so hard to avoid. Violence can act as a stand-in for sex then. Since gay sex is considered especially transgressive, how better to metaphorically depict it than with stabbing? There's something highly erotic about the scene where Billy and Stu stab each other. Screamed, an unauthorized musical parody, somehow makes this scene even hornier. It's not just the penetration and the knife as a phallic symbol, though that's certainly part of it, because this scene feels much more sexual than the straight-up murders depicted in the film thus far. I think part of it is that we aren't dealing with a masked killer anymore. We actually see Billy and Stu's faces, and especially the way they look at each other. Another aspect is the consent. They want the other to stab them, they're really into it. The dialogue is very suggestive as well.
Yeah! I'm ready, baby! Alright! Get up! Yeah, man, get up!
Don't forget, stay to the side and don't go too deep.
The final component, I think, is the reciprocity that comes in tandem with the consent, something that we don't see with the other murders. Ghostface, while in costume and up to this point in the movie, may be bludgeoned by a phone or a door or beamed with a beer bottle, but he's never stabbed. Blood is never drawn like it is in this scene. In that sense, they're losing their virginity to each other, as symbolized by the blood on the knife. They were each other's first time being stabbed. How cute! Sex is about power. All throughout the film, Billy pressures Sydney into having sex, presumably penetrative sex. In Penetration and Power, McKee writes,
Typically, penetration has involved a physically stronger person entering or being enveloped by a physically less strong person. The relevance of such a history for attempts to work out who is in the powerful position in a moment of penetration are obvious.
McKee argues that while there is no one definitive way to determine who is in a position of power in a sex scene, the use of textual and historical context can be informative in interpreting power dynamics. In Scream, up until the scene in the Mocker's master bedroom, Billy is the one advocating for having sex, while Sid is more timid. She feels social and personal pressure to have sex with Billy.
Yeah, but he has been so patient with me. You know, with all this sex stuff. How many guys will put up with a girlfriend who's sexually anorexic?
I have a girlfriend who would rather accuse me of being a psychopathic killer than touch me.
Randy also brings up Sydney not wanting to have sex with Billy as a possible motive for him wanting to kill her. Sid is made to feel as though she's being selfish for withholding access to her body from Billy, which is clearly a big part of her motivation in initiating sex with him at Stu's house. She's grieving the death of her mother, but she also thinks that she's using that as an excuse. Her real hang-up seems to be her fear that she's going to be a slut just like her mom. This is clear through her dialogue in this scene and from the audio commentary. Kevin Williamson explains.
Her mother was a loose woman, and Sydney's a virgin, and she's sort of her sexual life is sort of guarded by this knowledge of her mother.
We do not see the pair have intercourse, but both times we see them in a sexual context, Billy is on top of Sid and the more active participant of the two, while Sid is more passive. It is not unreasonable to assume, especially given how the characters confirm that Sid lost her virginity in the kitchen scene, and also based on commentary from Wes Craven regarding a later scene, which we'll get to, that the pair had penetrative sex. This also makes sense for a first time between two teenagers in a heterosexual relationship, as we can infer from historical context. Sex and power are tied together in Scream on multiple levels. The first component to this equation is penetration. From the point where Billy impliedly penetrates Sydney in the Mocker's bedroom to the end of the kitchen scene, Billy is indisputably in a position of power over her. The kitchen scene is Sydney's lowest point, as she is held captive and tortured by Billy and his loving accomplice. The dialogue in this scene reinforces the idea that penetration is linked to power.
Fuck you!
No. We already played that game, remember? You lost.
These lines frame topping as winning and bottoming as losing. Billy, in turn, begins losing his position of control when he is penetrated by Stu. From this point on, things start going wrong in Ghostface's plan, as Gale distracting the pair allows Sydney to escape. Sydney further turns the tables by penetrating both of the boys, stabbing Billy with the umbrella, biting Stu, fingering Billy's wound, and shooting Billy in the head. Sydney penetrating Billy with her finger is particularly sexual in connotation. As Wes Craven says in the audio commentary,
Yeah, this finger in the wound business, I don't think that was in the script. It was just trying to think of the most sort of intimate reverse lovemaking you could have. It's for her to be sticking her finger into him, into his wound. Just thought it was really incredibly perverse.
Poor Billy boyfriend. Looks like you fingered the wrong guy.
At this point, Billy and Sydney's roles have been reversed in every way. Their sexual roles have been reversed, with Sydney now as the top and Billy as the bottom, and Sydney's taking on of the Ghostface mantle and stabbing Billy have reversed their roles as killer and victim. Sydney's adoption of the Ghostface mantle coincides directly with her turning the tides against Billy and Stu. She is now the one taunting them on the phone, she is now the one attacking them in costume, and she is now the one performing the penetration. She is now the one in power. The second component in Scream's sex and power equation is discursive power. The line,
We already played that game, remember? You lost.
Can alternately be interpreted as framing giving in to sex or losing virginity as losing because Sid gave in to what Billy wanted. McKee writes,
It is possible, then, to move beyond previous attempts to tie down power relations in penetrative acts as unsatisfactory, and to propose in their place a different object of power, discourse. The power of the penetratee comes from his control over language. His power is a directorial power.
This sort of power is apparent in the relationship between Billy and Stu. It is apparent throughout the movie that Billy is the leader while Stu is the follower.
You're such a little lapdog.
Billy's discursive power is also exemplified in their metaphorical sex scene. Billy directs Stu to stay to the side and don't go too deep when he stabs or penetrates him. Stu does not so direct Billy when the knife is in the other hand, he just eggs him on. Turning back to Billy and Sydney's relationship, their power dynamic can also be tracked through discourse. Billy manipulates Sydney throughout the film, culminating in her deciding to have sex with him despite her reservations. In her 1969 essay, On Celibacy, feminist Dana Densmore equates sexual domination to subjugation, writing,
How repugnant it is, after all, to make love to a man who despises you, who fears you, and wants to hold you down.
Billy leverages their sexual encounter over Sydney in the kitchen scene, repeatedly reminding her that they just had sex.
We already played that game, remember? That made you have sex with a psychopath.
He's hitting her where it hurts because she just confessed to him that she was insecure about having sex because then she would be a slut just like her mom. He's beating her down emotionally as well as threatening her physically. It all feeds into his power over her in this scene. Inversely, it is apparent that Sydney has turned the tables on Billy when she escapes the kitchen and adopts the Ghostface mantle. This change is revealed to the audience by Sydney calling and verbally taunting Billy and Stu on the phone. Sydney's directorial power is cemented by her shooting Billy. By killing him, she has removed his ability to speak, and now she has control over the narrative.
Not in my movie.
Third and finally, gender comes into play. Scream relies on historical context to inform an audience presumption that a male character has power in a sexual encounter over a female character. We see the power that male characters have over Sydney in Scream through their objectification of her. Mulvey's writing highlights the tendency for women in film to be objectified by the male audience and male characters in diegesis. By giving her a starring role as a victim in their horror movie plot, Billy and Stu essentially turn Sydney into an object to kill, a prop, literally removing her personhood from her so that she is reduced to a corpse, an object. However, Shapiro finds that
eventually, each female protagonist rejects the male gaze, as well as her portrayal as a sexual object.
This is true for Sydney when she fights Stu in the climax of the film.
I always had a thing for you, Sid! In your dreams!
I think that it's important that this interaction is with Stu, who pointedly objectified Jamie Lee Curtis earlier in the movie.
Let me see breasts. I want to see Jamie Lee's breasts. When do we see Jamie Lee's breasts?
It is also key that Sydney takes on the Ghostface mantle when turning the tables on Billy and Stu. As discussed in part 1 of this essay, Ghostface is a presumptively masculine identity. By donning Ghostface's appearance and voice, Sydney has put herself on equal footing with Billy and Stu. This shift into a masculine persona signals to the audience that Sydney has gained power. The shift in point of view also emphasizes this change. Up to this point in the story, we haven't really ever seen events from Billy or Stu's POV because they were suspects. However, at this point, we know who the killers are. They have the same information as the audience. We, like the killers, don't know where Sydney is hiding, so we're aligned with them briefly in this scene as Stu talks to her on the phone and Billy searches for her. This contrasts with the scene playing on the TV in Halloween where we're in Laurie's POV as she hides in the closet. Here, though it would have been an obvious parallel to do so, we're not in Sydney's POV as she does the same. While this scene thus contrasts with Halloween, it aligns with the experiences of the female victims we've seen earlier in Scream, talking to Ghostface on the phone while he is concealed both from them and from the audience. Conclusion on sex and power. Sex and power are two essential interwoven components to Scream. Sex is evoked through metaphors. Ghostface's knife can be understood as a phallic symbol, and the scene where Billy and Stu stab each other symbolizes gay sex. Throughout Scream, Billy pressures Sydney into giving her virginity to him, despite her reservations. He takes sexual power over her by penetrating her, manipulating her, and by virtue of their traditional gender roles as male and female. In the climax of the film, their power dynamics are reversed in 3 ways. First, their sexual positions are reversed as Sydney penetrates Billy. Second, their discursive power is reversed as Sydney takes directorial control of the narrative. Finally, their gender roles are reversed as Sydney takes on the masculine Ghostface persona and Billy and Stu take on the role of the female victims Ghostface calls on the phone.
To briefly summarize before I give my concluding remarks, in this video I discussed how sex, gender, and power are portrayed in Scream through feminist and queer lenses. In the first part of this video, we looked at Scream's female characters through psychoanalytic, rhetorical, and qualitative analyses. The film is a bit of a mixed bag across all 3 frameworks. Psychoanalytic principles are both employed straightforwardly and utilized subversively. The film attempts to forego female objectification and subvert genre tropes regarding female sexuality. It succeeds in some ways and falls flat in others. Sydney is not objectified, but Tatum is. Sydney is allowed to be sexual and live, but Casey, Tatum, and Maureen are not. In the second part of the video, I discussed Billy and Stu as an iteration of the queer villain trope. A Doylist explanation suggests that Billy and Stu are queer as an homage to classic queer killers. A Watsonian explanation posits that Billy and Stu choose to express their queerness through villainous acts. In the third section, we turned our attention to how sex and power are interwoven in Scream. We first looked at how everything is about sex by interpreting Ghostface's knife as a phallic symbol and Billy and Stu stabbing each other as a metaphorical sex scene. We then looked at how sex is about power by examining the dynamics of the relationships between Sydney, Billy, and Stu. The three facets of power that we discussed, penetration, discourse, and gender roles, are all flipped in Sydney's favor by the end of the film. Scream uses its unique posture as both a satire and homage to classic horror to take its themes of sex, gender, and power in really interesting directions. Horror as a genre is especially significant for women and queer folks. As Freeland notes, horror originated from the Gothic novel, a fact in itself important for feminists to note because of the unusual prevalence of women as both writers and readers in this genre. The prevalence of the final girl as a slasher movie trope is perhaps reflective of the genre's feminine history. Despite the gripes I mentioned, I do appreciate how compelling all of the female characters were in Scream, and how the film centered the story on a thoughtful and sincere exploration of Sydney's trauma, perfectly balanced against the goofier aspects of the script. The appeal of a genre that focuses on the plight of an underdog protagonist, and that is given greater license to probe cultural anxieties and explore the deviant and taboo to queer audiences is self-evident. As Kevin Williamson says, I think gay kids everywhere understand that survival element that we have to sort of create in ourselves, and when we're watching that final girl have to prove herself and rise to the challenge and save her life, I think that's something gay kids everywhere can relate to. Scream presents both the relatable protagonist and relatable villains to queer viewers, providing two alternate life paths that don't end in heterosexual romance. Looking at it from a certain perspective, both Billy and Sydney are able to end the film free from their unhealthy relationship with each other. The reversal of sexual power dynamics in the climax of Scream is endlessly fascinating to me. From a feminist perspective, it is satisfying to see a female character thoroughly defeat her male tormentors. From a queer perspective, it is satisfying to see how traditional heterosexual conventions of sex and gender are defied by Sydney, and how the script rewards her defiance with success.
That concludes this video essay on this wonderful film. What do you think about the ways sex, gender, and power are portrayed in Scream? I would love to hear your thoughts, so please tell me. I think it would be so fun if we could get a discussion forum vibe going in the comments. This is my first ever video essay, so please forgive any editing mistakes. I did my best to cite everything as I went along, but in case I missed anything, all of the sources I used, including the background music, are listed at the end of this video and should be appearing right about now. Please also go check out the other video essays I cited, especially Video Nasty's essay on Scream. It's so good. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like to let me know. That's all for now. Take care.